Hello, I'm Richard Murphy. I want to talk to you about a term that I've created, which is carbon insolvency. Carbon insolvency really matters. What it talks about is whether or not a company can financially make the transition from its current state of activity to the one that it must be in if it is going to be net zero carbon compliant. In other words, if it is literally going to play its part in meeting the overall objective that we as a country and frankly as a planet need to have to ensure that we do not produce carbon in the future to guarantee our survival on this planet as a human race. Now, this isn't an option. We are told by scientists, I'm not a scientist, I'm not pretending I am, but we're told by scientists that we have no choice but become net zero carbon. And there's been a lot of debate, but frankly, I believe them. I'm willing to. The massive scientific opinion is now on the side of those who demand net zero carbon. So, if that's the case, we need to know how the world can change in practice. Because it's all very well saying this must be done by a particular date. But this has real world consequences, obviously for you and me as consumers and how we literally use the world's resources in our daily lives, but also for the businesses that we engage in and with. And carbon insolvency is a way of demanding that companies work out whether they can become literally net zero carbon compliant. It's part of something I call sustainable cost accounting, but the term is more important in some ways than any other element within that because it resonates with people. And sustainable cost accounting says that a company must prepare a business plan for becoming net zero carbon compliant over the timescale that it thinks appropriate. Now, some people say that's up until 2050. I think that's far too long. I think 2030 is probably, although desirable, very difficult. I suspect it's somewhere between 2030 and 2040. And once they've set that date, they then have to work out their route map, what it is that they must change. Are there available technologies which will let them adapt what they do now to what they must do to be net zero carbon? How much will they cost? Will they be able to raise the money to do that? Will they be able to make money out of the products that they make now if they adapt their processes to be net zero carbon compliant? Will they still employ people? Will there still be people who want to work for them? Will they be able to get hold of the resources that they then need to manage this process of change? Now, all of those are practical questions, but they transform into a basic question, which is of finance. The financial question is quite simply, can they raise the money to manage this process of change? If they can, then they are carbon solvent. In other words, they expect to now get through the process of change and still be in business at the end of the transition process with a net zero carbon business which is operating successfully and making a profit, which is a precondition of long-term survival of the business community. If they can't make that process of change, they've got two choices. They've either got to identify the people who might give them the money that they need, whether that be shareholders or bankers or some other form of financier who can fund the process of change for them, or they have to declare something else, which is that they are carbon insolvent. They cannot adapt their business either technically, it's just not possible to make it net carbon zero compliant, or they can't raise the money to achieve that goal. For either of those reasons, and if they're both or either of them are true, then that company is carbon insolvent. And that means, in very real terms, that by the date when net carbon zero is required, they must go out of business. It's as simple as that. There isn't going to be room for them in the world that we can then have. So what we demand of a company who is carbon insolvent is that they begin an organised winding up of their affairs. They recognise that they're not going to be a going concern in the long term and now begin to plan how this process will begin to be wound up. Now, let's use a simple example. Let's have a business that is completely dedicated to servicing petrol and diesel cars. and does not imagine that it is in any way going to be able to adapt itself to servicing electric vehicles. If that's the case, and we're not going to have petrol and diesel cars, as we know we will not be able to do in the future if we are to meet the net zero carbon requirement, then that business is inevitably carbon insolvent because it cannot adapt its processes. Alternatively, if it could make the transition to servicing electric vehicles, but cannot imagine a way in which it could raise the funding that is required to replace all its existing equipment and technology with that which it will need to manage electric vehicles, then it's also carbon insolvent. But in either case, that business isn't going to be with us in the long term. Now, let's be clear, lots of businesses don't survive in the long term. In fact, one of the things about most businesses is that they have a lot shorter lifespan than we, thankfully, do. But recognising that the business is not a going concern is one of the critical issues in accounting. And that's why I want sustainable cost accounting. Because unless we go through this process of checking that a business is a going concern, not just financially, but within the constraint of finance and net zero carbon, we can't be sure which businesses are going to be with us in the long term and which are therefore going to be going concerns, which is one of the critical issues which accountancy faces. So carbon insolvency is something that we really, really need to think about, because it determines the face of our future business community and who's going to be in it and what they're going to be doing and how they're going to be funded for the benefit of who, which is us. So carbon insolvency is, I hope, a term you're going to become increasingly familiar with, because it's going to shape our future business landscape. I'm Richard Murphy. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this video series on YouTube if you're interested. Also look for us on Facebook. I am on Twitter at Richard J. Murphy. And at the same time, look at my blog, Tax Research UK, where you can find much more on these themes. And I'll see you again soon.